Welcome to a new episode of TTG Conversations 5 Questions video series. This episode will focus on the future of border controls at airports. Giving us insights on this topic is Jeremy Springall, Vice President, Border Management with CETA. So based in London, Jeremy leads the CETA at Borders business, which focuses on border security and facilitation. Previously, he ran the systems integration business of CETA, delivering some of the industry's most complex airports and border management projects globally. Prior to joining CETA, Jeremy was the Vice President and Business Unit Leader for the Oil, Gas, Transportation business of CGI, and previously ran the Global Transportation business of Logica, which CGI acquired in 2012. Jeremy has significant experience with both governments and the broader air transportation industry. He's perfect for our topic today. So welcome, Jeremy, and thank you for giving us your time.
Yeah, hi, Karen.
I've got 5 questions for you, and here's the first. Voices in the travel and tourism industry are singing the same tune these days, that a safe, controlled, and practical reopening is critical for saving the industry and the global economy. How does that safe, controlled, and practical formula look for border control?
Yeah, no, thanks, Karen. Yes, as obviously countries look to ease their travel restrictions, they're going to be very, very mindful of preventing a resurgence of cases into their country. So governments are going to take a very controlled approach to opening up their borders. So, for example, we're seeing many countries around the world implement or talk about travel corridors or travel bubbles. And I guess these travel corridors can be categorized into 2 broad areas. The first is really around having more of an open corridor or a safe travel zone, where you've got 2 or more countries that have low levels of the virus. And it might be, and we might see, more near normal free movement of people within that safe bubble or safe zone. The other type is more of a restricted corridor, and this is where we're going to see a much more tighter control of that corridor and that border by the government. So that's likely to include a much higher degree of proving that you've had a test for the virus, might include the test process itself. And it might also include some element of quarantine on arrival for the passenger as well. In order to do that, many governments take a layered approach to border management, and that starts well in advance of travel. And the whole idea here is if governments can identify those high-risk passengers that potentially are, most likely to have the virus or could come into contact with the virus. And if they can prevent or limit the travel of those high-risk passengers, then ideally that makes the low-risk majority make their journey through the airport and across the border much simpler. Really, there are 4 probably notable steps in that layered approach that are probably worth highlighting. The first is the travel authorization process. So, this typically and traditionally is where a passenger, applies for entry into the country using a visa or an ETA type approach. And what we're now seeing is governments also request that passenger to submit information about their health through a health declaration or a health ETA. And that might also include uploading of a COVID certificate to prove that they are, then obviously not carrying the virus at that point in the travel. So, and we're obviously helping a lot of governments around the world looking at those sort of solutions to help ease and implement the travel at that point. The second step, which is probably the most critical actually, is at the point of check-in. And this is where governments that have an advanced passenger processing system, that will enable them to do a real-time check at the point of check-in and prevent high-risk passengers, or for example passengers that haven't completed a health ETA, from actually boarding their flight. So, and the whole idea here is they'd much prefer to stop the person traveling in the first place and obviously not go through the airports and turn up at their border. they'd much prefer to let the passenger know they can't travel in advance, during their check-in process. So I think that's going to be very, very critical as we sort of enter out of the travel restrictions. Mm-hmm. And we've been helping governments again adapt their advanced passenger processing processes to react to COVID-19. So at the early part of the pandemic, a lot of governments, for example, we helped the government of Uruguay stop passengers traveling into their country and checking in for their flights that are traveling from high-risk locations. Okay. Mm-hmm. The third, I guess, notable step is at the airport itself. So you arrive at the airport, and ideally what we want to do there is ensure as contactless approach into the airport as possible and across the border. Clearly, we want to limit the possibility of transmission during the airport, limit the ability for people to come into contact with each other. So, really making sure that people are able to social distance and use things like biometric technology to ensure that they don't actually need to even touch some of the airport devices, so they can sort of move through the airport and across the border in the simplest way possible. And clearly one of the things that the border agency is going to be very mindful of is that they don't want big queues forming at the border. That's obviously a big risk. So if they can help smooth their way through by having sort of safe travel lanes at the border point itself, by using biometrics and other forms of identity solutions, then obviously that's going to help the situation as well. And the last element really in that process is then post-travel. What governments also need to do is be able to track and trace people that might have come into contact with other people with the virus during their journey. So clearly what we're doing is capturing a lot of information about individuals, including hopefully their destination address, and therefore and we also know where you were sitting on the aircraft, as an example. So if somebody who had subsequently been identified as having the virus was sitting near you on the aircraft, then the government can reach out to you, make contact with you to say that you might have come into contact with somebody or close contact with somebody, and therefore they can reach out to you, ask you to take a test or to self-isolate for a period of time, and therefore minimizing the possibility of the spread of the virus into that country. So those are probably the main things that the border agencies are now looking at in order to really open up their borders.
You spoke about biometrics, and here in Asia, we have a fresh example of how the future of airport clearance would be. So Beijing Capital International Airport recently had an extensive biometric deployment, which was made possible by CETA's technology. So will you tell me why this deployment means so much for the industry's effort to resume travel during a pandemic?
Yeah, no, thanks, Karen. I think the Beijing Capital International Airport project is a great example of where an airport can implement contactless technology through the entire process. Mm-hmm. So, and clearly that will help limit the possibilities of, the passenger coming into contact with the virus, hopefully, and obviously transmitting the virus. So ideally what we want to do is move to contactless, so you don't need to go to a check-in desk, or you don't need to touch a physical kiosk within the airport itself. Almost you can do that in a very contactless way. So for Beijing Capital, what we've done is we've implemented over 600 biometric checkpoints through the airport. So the passenger can check in for their flight, they can drop off their bag, they can go through security, and they can board their flight purely using their biometrics, their face, as their boarding pass. Mm-hmm. So ideally, they don't need to touch any of that equipment or anything like that. So obviously, that's going to lower the risk of the spread of the virus. And that level of automation also supports social distancing and supports the flow of the passenger through the airport, which is obviously also going to help. And it can also help speed up the process of of processing passengers at those different points. So, for example, for Beijing International, what we can now do is at the point of boarding, we can now process over 400 passengers boarding onto an Airbus A380 in less than 20 minutes. So, which is a big, increase in or decrease in the time to do that. And obviously, wherever we can do to sort of minimize that can help the efficiency of the airport, but it can also obviously limit the impact around the virus. What we're also doing in other airports is very much using the passenger's mobile device itself to sort of be that main point of interaction. So again, instead of having to use the kiosk, the passenger can put the information into their mobile device. It can communicate with the check-in kiosk, and it can automatically print out maybe your self bag drop label and things like that. So again, there's a lot of this sort of technology there that is definitely going to have a big improvement, and hopefully that will give passengers a lot more confidence around traveling, because they're not going to be hopefully taking a big risk by doing that, and therefore they're all hopefully that will obviously improve their ability to travel going forward.
Beijing Capital's use of SITA's Smart Path has also demonstrated a smoother retailing experience at the airport's duty-free shops. Can biometric deployment in general benefit the wider hospitality industry beyond the airport?
Yeah, no, certainly. And there's a lot of examples of this use of technology beyond the airport. I mean, Beijing Capital, as you mentioned, we're using that technology in the duty-free shops. Again, as your face is your boarding pass, so proving the fact that you are making a journey and therefore you are eligible for duty-free. But there's plenty of other examples. We're members of the World Travel and Tourism Council, and the WTTC have got a program looking at what we call the seamless traveller journey, and that's looking at the whole end-to-end journey from right at the start when you're planning your journey, you're applying for a visa. You can do that online or using your mobile device, and use that to take your biometrics rather than having to travel into an embassy to apply for the visa. So you can do all of that online. Obviously, the travel to the airport, through the airport, at the destination airport, hopefully we can use the same identity as you go from one country to another. And then post your travel, as you might want to have a hire car, again use that same identity, your biometric, to hire your car, to check into your hotel, and even to get into your hotel room. So again, looking at that whole end-to-end process and looking at how this technology is going to support that. What we're also looking at doing, and the industry is doing quite widely, is also looking at things like large events. So things like maybe the Olympics or the World Cup, or big events like that, where you've got large volumes of people. And obviously currently that's is also a big concern. How do you get people safely into a stadium in the right way? So again, we can use this technology to help the entry and exit into a stadium in a much faster, more applicable way, again using your face as your ticket into the stadium, and also linking that back to the whole visa process. So if somebody is applying for a tourist visa, then again, how does that country make it easier for somebody to move around the country as a tourist, and they can link their visa process with their purpose in the country. So if they're traveling into the country to attend the World Cup, then they can link the whole process together. So your initial visa application is also your ticket into the World Cup, into the stadium.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, still on the Beijing Capital Airport. Now, this biometric deployment is said to be SITA's most extensive in the world to date. Why is this so, when biometric technology, specifically iris identification, has been around since the 90s? And what challenges do airports face in getting the system off the ground?
Yeah, you're You're absolutely right. It's taken us a very long while to get here. I think probably the main reason for that is airports are very complex environments. Typically a large airport like Beijing Capital, but even medium-sized airports can have, tens, if not hundreds of airlines working within them. So these are complex environments to implement these sort of solutions, and therefore what we've been seeing over the last few years is airports trial this technology for specific uses. So for maybe boarding a flight or for checking in, but Beijing Capital is really the first large example of its type where we're really seeing this end-to-end process where the passenger can move across the airport in its entirety, using this sort of technology. The other thing is that almost the technology has also been waiting for other parts of technology to catch up as well. So yes, whilst it's been around for a very long time, so a good example of that is, in order for it to work, we need to have a way of capturing somebody's biometric identity. So, and obviously for the travel process, the best way of doing that is your biometric passport. And obviously crossing the border, you would definitely need that. And we're only now seeing, a full adoption of wide adoption of biometric passports, across the world. So obviously that's certainly helped with that as well. There are a few areas that are probably worth considering in terms of the challenges that airports are going to have if deploying these technologies. Probably the first to raise is obviously one around data privacy, and this has been raised, around the world is obviously a concern and as an issue. And obviously, when we're implementing these sort of solutions, airports need to be obviously very mindful. We're handling very sensitive information, personal information about the traveller. Obviously, in the current context, that might include health information. So obviously, we need to be very mindful, and therefore the data that we're holding needs to be managed in a very ethical way. It should only be used for the purpose that we collect it for, and it should be only held for as long as absolutely necessary, for that particular purpose. So I think that data privacy angle is something that we all need to look at and obviously consider around that to ensure we are working in the right ethical way around these solutions. The second is really around sharing of data, and this is where the complexity of the airport comes in. Typically in an airport environment, we've got many different stakeholders. Clearly, we've got the airport itself, we've got lots of different airlines, we've got ground handlers and other organizations involved, including the government, and therefore we might have to, for this solution to work, we might need to share data between those different organizations. So the airline might be sharing data with the airport that is managing one element of the process, and the government might be managing another element of the process. So again, in order to do that properly, we need some industry standards about how to do that on a global basis. And those industry standards are still adopting, still being adapted and being adopted out. So there's still more work to be done around that standards piece as well. And I think the final element again goes back to the number of these stakeholders. It's around collaboration. In order to make these projects work, we absolutely need to ensure close collaboration of all those different stakeholders. So obviously that needs to make sure that everyone's got the buy-in to these sort of projects. It's not about the airport doing it by themselves. They've got to get that collaboration going with the other stakeholders.
Great point. Do you see the pandemic and the need for contactless everything planting a seed of urgency among airports to expedite biometric trials and deployment? Is this crisis the unexpected hero, the trigger the world needs to get closer to IATA's One ID vision?
Yeah, well, certainly the crisis has accelerated the whole piece. I think it's highlighted, a real need for this sort of technology, and I think without it, actually, it's going to be much harder to obviously to start traveling again. And particularly around the contactless nature of this, and the the identity component of this, really understanding, who that individual is across that entire journey piece. And yeah, absolutely, as a supplier to the industry, it's accelerated our research and our development of our products to bring to the market. So it certainly is accelerating that vision. So yes, maybe it is a positive coming out of a very difficult situation.
Great, and that's all the questions I have for you, Jeremy. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you. It was great to talk to you, Karen.
Yep. And if there are topics you'd like us to tackle on this video series, please leave your comments below. We will love to hear from you. So everyone, take care and stay safe. Thank you. Goodbye.